Deep in the wild hollows of southeastern Kentucky, where Devil's Creek cuts through limestone cliffs and dark forests, old county records from the 1880s leave gaps that no historian has ever explained. Between 1881 and 1889, more than 40 travelers disappeared without a trace along the mountain road, linking Pineville to the coal camps farther east. What makes this story even more unsettling is that during those same years, the Harland family of Devil's Creek somehow rose to become the largest meat supplier in 3 counties, despite owning a farm with fewer than 20 head of cattle. For generations, officials have avoided talking about what really happened in those mountains. But newly uncovered letters and testimonies suggest a secret so horrific that the community buried it for more than a century. The Devil's Creek settlement had never been intended as anything more than a stopover. Most people passing through were following the old Cherokee Trail, an ancient route that connected the Kentucky River Basin to the coal-rich mountains farther east. By 1879, the region was beginning to taste the first wave of industrial prosperity. Coal discoveries transformed quiet farming communities into hubs of sudden wealth, and the arrival of new railroads brought investors, miners, and merchants into the most remote corners of the state. That constant flow of travelers made the Devil's Creek Passage a critical link. The valley itself was barely 2 miles long and squeezed between high limestone cliffs that forced everyone into a single narrow trail. The creek ran cold and clear year-round, fed by hidden springs, making it a perfect place for both men and animals to rest. At the entrance to this valley stood the Harland family homestead, a weathered log cabin built in the 1840s by Josiah Harland, who had moved his family into the wilderness after losing his farm to debt. Josiah died in 1878, leaving his land and trade to his 3 sons, Ezekiel, Caleb, and Samuel. Known as expert butchers, the brothers carried on their father's skill and quickly earned a reputation for speed, precision, and high quality. Their smoked meats and sausages became favorites among traders who paid top prices for goods that lasted on the long, rough trails. While other mountain families struggled with the changes brought by coal and railroads, the Harlands saw opportunity. By 1880, they had built a surprisingly advanced smokehouse and curing facility carved into the hillside behind their cabin. Merchants traveled from as far as Lexington to buy their mountain sausage and dried beef, praised for a flavor unlike anything else in Kentucky. Ezekiel, the eldest, handled business and customers with sharp eyes and a carefully kept beard that gave him an air of authority. Caleb ran the curing process, claiming he used methods picked up from German immigrants who once passed through. Samuel, the youngest, was the most skilled with a blade, able to take apart livestock with the speed of a surgeon. Their growing success seemed remarkable for a modest family farm, especially when weighed against the chilling reality that dozens of travelers vanished on the very trail that passed their door. The Harland brothers had never taken wives, a fact that raised eyebrows in a place and time where men of their age were usually married with children. They brushed off questions by saying their business left no time for family life, and they stuck to a strict routine that had them awake before dawn, working side by side in the fields and at their smokehouse. Their nearest neighbors, the Whitfields, lived half a mile downstream and ran the small general store that served both locals and travelers. Thomas Whitfield often wondered aloud how the Harlands managed to process so much meat when their herd was barely large enough to support even a modest operation. He assumed they had outside suppliers, though he never saw evidence of it. The other families in Devil's Creek, farmers like the Rowlands, Napiers, and Combs, got by through subsistence crops and the occasional trade with travelers. They offered water feed for horses' tool repairs, and sometimes a place to sleep. To them, the Harlands were both admired and envied. Their business seemed to bring prosperity to the valley, but their secretive nature left neighbors uneasy about how they truly sustained it. By the spring of 1881, The Harland operation was running at full tilt. Day and night the valley echoed with the thud of axes and the crack of cleavers, while smoke from their curing chambers left a permanent haze hanging over their end of the hollow. Thomas Whitfield wrote in his journal that the brothers worked harder than ever, but their herd remained as small as ever. The first real sign that something was wrong came on a hot June evening in 1881. Benjamin Crawford, a Louisville merchant known for his reliability, failed to arrive at the Combs cabin, where he had planned to spend the night. Crawford was a familiar face along the trail, hauling manufactured goods to the mining camps and carrying coal samples back east. That very morning, he had stopped at the Whitfield store to buy supplies, cheerfully announcing that he had secured a lucrative contract with a mining company and would be stopping by the Harlands to place a large order of preserved meats before bedding down at the Combs home. When he never showed Daniel Combs, assumed Crawford had simply pushed ahead. But the next morning changed everything. Crawford's horse was found wandering near the limestone cliffs on the valley's eastern edge, saddle intact, sample cases still strapped to its sides. Inside the cases were Crawford's usual assortment of goods, along with a leather folder holding several $100s from earlier transactions. No thief would have overlooked that money. A search party formed quickly. For 3 days, the men of Devil's Creek scoured the valley and hills, crawling through caves and sinkholes, searching game trails and ravines. The search was meticulous, covering ground locals had known for decades. The only clue they uncovered was Crawford's hat snagged on a branch less than a quarter-mile upstream from the Harlan property. There was no body, no sign of a struggle, no blood. Nothing that suggested either an accident or an animal attack. The horse itself seemed calm, uninjured, and perfectly bridled, as if it had simply been abandoned. Throughout the search, Ezekiel Harlan was especially helpful. He and his brothers guided searchers into caves and mine shafts others might have overlooked, lending their knowledge of the land. When the search ended without answers, Ezekiel suggested Crawford had likely fallen victim to one of the drifters, who occasionally passed through the region, murdered for his money, and hidden in one of the countless limestone sinkholes. It was a reasonable theory on the surface. But to those who remembered the untouched cash in Crawford's saddlebag, it did little to ease suspicion. Thomas Whitfield wrote in his journal that Crawford's disappearance left him uneasy, not only because of the missing man, but because the Harlans seemed less troubled than everyone else, almost as though they had expected it. 3 weeks later, his unease turned to dread when a second traveler vanished in nearly the same way. This time it was James Toiver, a mining engineer from Virginia, surveying potential railroad routes. Toiver had been traveling with a local guide, but when he paused to take measurements along Devil's Creek, the two men separated. The guide went on ahead to secure lodging, while Toiver lingered with his equipment. By the next morning, Toiver's tools were found abandoned about 200 yards below the Harlan property. His horse was discovered later, grazing peacefully in a meadow, with reins dragging saddlebags intact and no sign of its rider. Like Crawford, Toiver had simply vanished. The second disappearance shook the families of Devil's Creek. 2 seasoned travelers, both cautious and experienced in mountain conditions, had disappeared within weeks of each other along the same stretch of trail. Fear began to spread, and neighbors quietly discussed abandoning their homes for safer ground. It was Martha Whitfield who first gave voice to what many were already thinking. Both disappearances had occurred near the Harlan homestead. Both men carried money, and both times the Harlan smokehouse had seemed busier than ever, with smoke rising day and night, and the sound of axes and cleavers ringing through the valley. Thomas dismissed his wife's suspicions at first, but he began to watch his neighbors more closely, and what he noticed would stay with him the rest of his life. Though not formally educated, Thomas had decades of mountain wisdom. He knew when weather was about to turn, when animals behaved strangely, and when something in his community was off. He started keeping careful notes of travelers who passed through the valley, recording when they stopped, where they stayed, and what business they conducted. A chilling pattern emerged. Ordinary travelers usually moved on without incident, but those who stopped at the Harlans and made substantial purchases often disappeared soon afterward. By the fall of 1881, Thomas had documented 7 vanishings that fit this pattern. In every case, the missing man had been seen at the Harlans shortly before vanishing. In every case, valuable goods or money had been left untouched, ruling out simple theft. And in every case, the Harlans themselves were eager participants in search efforts, often suggesting natural hazards as the explanation. Thomas also began noticing changes in his neighbors. The Harlan brothers' operation had expanded dramatically, yet their herd of cattle never seemed to grow. When Thomas questioned Ezekiel casually about this, the eldest brother claimed they were dealing directly with outside cattle suppliers, who delivered animals straight to their facility. The excuse sounded plausible, but Thomas had never once seen or heard cattle being driven along the valley trail, something that would have been impossible to miss. Stranger still were the Harlans themselves. Once reserved but friendly, they became withdrawn and unwelcoming, discouraging neighbors from dropping by. They shifted their work to nighttime hours, saying cooler temperatures preserved meat better. Their bodies grew heavier despite constant labor, their clothing became finer, and their possessions suddenly more expensive. Ezekiel, once a modest butcher, now carried a gold pocket watch, wore polished boots, and owned a rifle worth more than a farmer could hope to afford. Most unsettling of all was their attitude toward the missing travelers. Where other families worried and organized searches, the Harlans acted indifferent. They would help if asked, but rarely volunteered, and often insisted it was pointless to keep looking, claiming the missing had either moved on or died in places no one could reach. When winter closed the mountain trails in 1881, the disappearances stopped for a time. But Thomas Whitfield's suspicions only deepened. He was certain now that his neighbors had something to do with the vanished men, but without proof and without understanding the full truth, he had no way to confront what was becoming one of the darkest family enterprises in American frontier history. Thomas Whitfield's growing suspicion turned into genuine fear when he realized that his own family could be in danger. The Whitfield General Store wasn't just a place to buy supplies, it was the valley's unofficial information hub. Travelers often spoke freely there about their routes, business dealings, and how much money they carried. If the Harlan brothers were truly preying on wealthy travelers, then information from the store would have been invaluable. Thomas began to suspect that one or more of the brothers lingered nearby, listening to conversations in secret or coaxing details from neighbors about visitors to Devil's Creek. That thought chilled him. If his family had knowledge the Harlans wanted hidden, they could just as easily become victims themselves. By the spring of 1882, when the mountain trails opened again, Thomas resolved to gather proof. He started a dangerous surveillance campaign, carefully observing the Harlan property from concealed limestone outcroppings that overlooked their land. Using his late father's Civil War spyglass, he studied the brothers' daily routines. What he saw convinced him that the Harlans were not simply butchers, but predators with a system. Ezekiel stationed himself along the trail each morning, appearing to do farm work, while actually watching who passed through. When someone looked prosperous, fine clothes, well-fed horses, or heavy saddlebags, he would step out, greet them warmly, and often invite them to see the family's processing operation. Meanwhile, Caleb and Samuel prepared back at the facility, sharpening knives, setting tools, and arranging the work areas with a precision that felt less like routine butchering and more like soldiers preparing for an ambush. The moment of truth came on a foggy April morning when a merchant named Marcus Donovan arrived with 2 pack horses loaded with goods for the mining camps. Donovan was clearly well off, dressed in fine clothing and openly carrying a leather case that contained more than $1,000 in payments, an enormous sum for the mountains. He stopped by the Whitfield store for supplies, casually mentioning his fortune, and Thomas's stomach sank. Donovan fit the exact pattern he had been tracking for months. Against every instinct for self-preservation, Thomas decided to follow at a distance, slipping through game trails that ran parallel to the road. He watched as Ezekiel intercepted Donovan near the Harlan property, engaging him in friendly conversation, praising his fine horses and asking about his business. The merchant, unsuspecting, spoke openly about his contracts with the mining camps. When Ezekiel invited him to inspect their meats and perhaps arrange a supply deal, Donovan agreed without hesitation. But instead of taking him to the Maine smokehouse, Ezekiel led him toward a smaller structure Thomas had never paid much attention to, a building hidden behind trees and positioned just out of sight of the main trail. Through his spyglass, Thomas caught a glimpse inside. Heavy wooden tables dominated the space. Iron hooks dangled from the beams. Large barrels and vats lined the walls. It looked less like a simple storage shed and more like a specialized workshop built to process human-scale quantities of material. The moment Donovan stepped inside, Ezekiel's expression hardened, and with a subtle signal, Caleb and Samuel appeared. They moved quickly, silently, and with the precision of men who had rehearsed this moment countless times. Donovan's realization came too late. His startled posture, his instinctive reach for the door, Thomas saw it all. In that instant, his worst suspicions solidified into terrible certainty. The Harlan brothers were killers, and their slaughterhouse was not for cattle alone. When Marcus Donovan tried to back toward the doorway, Samuel Harlan was already there, blocking his escape. Donovan managed only a brief shout before Caleb swung a heavy wooden mallet across his head, dropping him instantly. What Thomas Whitfield then witnessed was a nightmare brought to life. The brothers stripped Donovan of clothing and valuables before setting upon his body with the practiced speed of seasoned butchers. They worked with frightening efficiency, dividing tissue from bone, preserving certain cuts of flesh with salts and smoke, and feeding other portions into a grinding machine that reduced them to pulp. Bones were cracked apart and submerged into vats of caustic liquid that would dissolve them within days. Anything that might identify Donovan was carefully destroyed, while valuables were tucked away for later use. In less than 3 hours, Marcus Donovan had been reduced to products destined for markets across the region, his existence erased as neatly as though he had never passed through Devil's Creek. Thomas remained hidden until nightfall, watching as the Harlans scoured their workspace until not a trace of Donovan remained. By the time he crept back to his cabin, he was sick to his stomach, but he carried with him knowledge that could save countless lives if he could survive long enough to tell it. He knew, however, that the danger was now personal. He was the only man outside the Harlan family who understood the truth, and the brothers had shown without doubt that they were capable of silencing anyone who threatened their secret. For days afterward, Thomas wrestled with indecision. Acting too quickly might doom his wife and children. But remaining silent condemned future travelers. His journal filled with desperate notes as he tried to plan a course of action. Meanwhile, the killings only accelerated. Within the first week of May 1882, 3 more men vanished: a Tennessee mining engineer, a Virginia cattle buyer, and another merchant bound for the coal camps. Each had last been seen in friendly conversation with Ezekiel Harlan. Each had vanished without a trace. Thomas kept detailed records, but the burden of knowledge was wearing him down. His wife Martha noticed the change, pressing him for answers he could not safely give. The breaking point came on May 15th, when U.S. Marshal William Patterson rode into Devil's Creek. Sent to investigate the growing string of disappearances, Patterson was a seasoned lawman tasked with deciding whether the missing men were victims of accidents, bandits, or something more sinister. His arrival offered Thomas both hope and terror. The marshal stopped by the Whitfield store to purchase supplies and gather information. To Thomas's horror, Patterson revealed that he had already been contacted by Ezekiel Harland, who had invited him to visit their facility and discuss the disappearances. Thomas realized the marshal was about to walk directly into the same trap that had claimed so many before him. Staying silent meant Patterson's death, and perhaps more danger for the community when federal authorities sent more men. Speaking up meant exposing himself as the only possible witness to the Harlands' crimes. On the evening of May 16th, Thomas made his choice. He sought Patterson privately at his cabin, his voice shaking as he told the marshal what he had seen with his own eyes. 3 respected butcher's men known for their trade were in fact responsible for dozens of disappearances. At first, Patterson scoffed at the claim. To him, the story sounded like mountain superstition, too grotesque to be believed. But Thomas persisted, laying out his journals, his records, and the horrifying details he had risked his life to gather. For the first time, the marshal's disbelief began to waver. The story Thomas laid before Marshal Patterson sounded so outlandish that it nearly defied belief. Yet his carefully kept journal, with precise dates and details, left little room for doubt. More damning still were his descriptions of the Harlands' hidden butchering shed, complete with its arrangement of hooks, vats, and tables details that could only have come from direct observation. Patterson's lawman instincts told him that Thomas might be the only witness to a criminal enterprise unlike anything he had ever encountered. Though cautious, Patterson agreed to investigate. He knew that if the Harlands were guilty, they weren't ordinary killers, but an organized family operation that had evaded detection for years. Any move against them had to be deliberate, with evidence strong enough to withstand scrutiny. Together, he and Thomas formed a plan. Patterson would accept the Harlands' invitation to tour their facility, keeping up the guise of a routine inquiry, while Thomas kept watch from his hidden vantage point. If Patterson failed to emerge by a set hour, Thomas would ride to the nearest telegraph station and summon reinforcements. But fate complicated their plan. On May 17th, a wealthy investor named Charles Pemberton arrived in Devil's Creek carrying banking documents and a case of funds meant for coal camp investments. To Thomas, it was clear Pemberton was the perfect kind of target the Harlands favored, and his presence threatened to accelerate their deadly timetable. The balance of caution and urgency shifted overnight. By the morning of May 18th, Patterson had resolved to act. The risk of inaction, he reasoned, was greater than confronting the Harlands directly. He left notes with his superiors detailing his intentions, concealed extra weapons on his person, and reminded Thomas of their signal plan. Mid-morning, he rode to the Harland homestead, his manner calm and professional. To Ezekiel and his brothers, it likely seemed like just another traveler wandering too close to their domain. From his hidden post, Thomas watched the encounter unfold. Patterson played the role of the polite investigator, allowing Ezekiel to lead him toward the smokehouse, while casually discussing travel conditions and trade. But when Ezekiel attempted to steer him toward the secondary structure, the killing shed Thomas knew too well, Patterson hesitated. Instead, he suggested they continue talking in the open air. The small refusal rattled the brothers. Thomas noticed the exchanged glances, the subtle shift in their posture. Patterson pressed his advantage. He began asking pointed questions about livestock deliveries, supplier contracts, and business records. His tone was polite but probing, his eyes fixed on the small cracks forming in Ezekiel's story. When Patterson requested to see written ledgers, Caleb gave a hand signal Thomas had already learned to dread. But this time, the Harlans miscalculated. When Ezekiel lunged with an iron tool, Patterson was ready. His revolver was out in an instant, the shot striking Ezekiel in the chest and sending him crashing to the ground. Chaos erupted as the other brothers moved, but the advantage belonged to a trained federal officer who had anticipated violence from the moment he set foot on their land. In a matter of seconds, the illusion of the Harlans as untouchable butchers of Devil's Creek shattered, and the bloody legacy they had built in secret was about to be dragged into the open. Samuel's ambush from behind failed. Patterson had chosen his position well, pivoting quickly and firing a second round that dropped the youngest Harlan where he stood. Caleb, now the last brother standing, panicked. Instead of fighting, he bolted toward the hidden slaughterhouse, desperate to protect what the family had worked so hard to conceal. Patterson pursued, revolver drawn, and at that moment, Thomas Whitfield emerged from his hiding place, sprinting down with a shotgun in hand to lend support. Together they cornered Caleb inside the secondary building, the very place Thomas had once watched Marcus Donovan meet his end. What they found inside confirmed every dark suspicion. The shed was not just a workspace, but a chamber of horrors. Human remains lay in various stages of disassembly, barrels and vats. Held grisly contents and shelves were stacked with the belongings of dozens of victims, watches, rings, purses, and travel papers. Ledgers detailed the brothers' crimes with chilling precision. It was overwhelming proof, impossible to deny. Caleb was taken alive, and under questioning he broke quickly, admitting to everything. His confession painted the full picture. Since the spring of 1881, the Harlan brothers had been targeting travelers who carried money contracts or valuable goods. They had studied patterns of movement through Devil's Creek, identifying which professions, merchants, investors, engineers, yielded the most profit. Once chosen, the victims were lured, killed, processed, and erased. Caleb estimated that more than 50 men had died at their hands in just 2 years. The methods were as meticulous as they were monstrous chemical vats to dissolve bones, grinding machines to obliterate flesh, and strict routines to destroy or repurpose clothing and equipment. The most revolting admission was that human flesh had been worked directly into their famous sausages and cured meats distributed widely throughout eastern Kentucky. Their special blend had drawn customers from miles away, people who unwittingly consumed the remains of travelers. When this revelation broke, shock turned to widespread revulsion. What had been a local horror became a national scandal, splashed across newspapers in Louisville, Lexington, and eventually as far away as New York and Chicago. The Devil's Creek murders were branded one of the most gruesome serial killing cases in 19th century America. The aftermath brought dramatic change. Caleb Harlan was transported under heavy guard to the county seat, where he stood trial for multiple counts of murder conspiracy and desecration of human remains. His own journals became the centerpiece of the prosecution, filled with entries detailing dates, methods, and even his thoughts on which victims produced the best quality meat. Seasoned lawmen and court officials were chilled by his clinical tone. Evidence presented at trial included the specialized tools from the slaughterhouse, clothing and valuables from dozens of victims, and testimony from experts about the chemical processes used to obliterate remains. The proceedings drew swarms of reporters, turning Devil's Creek into a media spectacle. Articles described the Harlans as both cunning and monstrous, their crimes a stain on the frontier community. Investigators traced distribution records showing that the brothers' meat products had reached hotels, mining camps, and restaurants across multiple counties. Customers who once praised Harlan sausages now recoiled in horror, realizing what they had consumed. Though the full scope of the brothers' crimes could never be completely proven, too much evidence had been destroyed. Their exposure marked the end of a reign of terror hidden behind the guise of respectability. For Thomas Whitfield and the families of Devil's Creek, the revelations forever scarred their community, turning a quiet mountain hollow into one of the most infamous crime scenes in American history. The revelation that hundreds of unsuspecting people had eaten human flesh sent shockwaves far beyond Devil's Creek. What began as a criminal case quickly escalated into a public health emergency. Officials had to trace shipments, identify where Harlan products had been sold, and counsel communities devastated by the knowledge of what they had consumed. For prosecutors, Thomas Whitfield's testimony was irreplaceable. His journals, maps, and first-hand surveillance provided a timeline that matched missing person reports from across the region. He was the only man alive who had seen the Harlan's methods with his own eyes. But that same courage made him and his family vulnerable. Some locals, furious that their quiet hollow had been dragged into the spotlight, blamed Thomas for destroying their way of life. Others had sympathized with the Harlans, choosing to see them as hard-working butchers rather than monsters. The Whitfields, once central to valley life, now carried a target on their backs. In the end, they chose to leave Devil's Creek, abandoning their store and homestead to escape the shadow of what they had uncovered. For the wider community, the psychological scars were deep. Families who had once trusted each other as neighbors now lived with the knowledge that three men they shared meals and church pews with had been dissecting travelers in secret. Trust, once the glue of survival in the mountains, was shattered. Several families moved away, entirely unable to live with the constant reminders of betrayal and horror. The Harlan property was seized and stripped bare. The slaughterhouse itself was preserved long enough to serve as trial evidence before being destroyed, but its memory lingered like a wound. Caleb Harlan, the sole surviving brother, was convicted on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to hang. Before the gallows could claim him, however, he died in his cell of a heart condition aggravated by stress, carrying with him secrets that might have identified more victims or even accomplices beyond Devil's Creek. Investigators uncovered hints that the Harlan's methods may not have been unique. Similar disappearances elsewhere in Appalachia suggested the possibility of a wider network of criminals preying on isolated travelers. But limited resources and jurisdictional divides meant these leads were never fully pursued. Still, Patterson's report became a blueprint for lawmen across the country. His systematic documentation, use of local witnesses, and methodical approach to organized rural crime were studied for decades afterward. The aftermath reshaped eastern Kentucky. Travelers became wary of stopping at isolated farms or smokehouses, and calls grew for stronger law enforcement in the mountains. Telegraph lines and better patrol routes were pushed forward by public demand. Courts, too, faced new challenges: how to preserve evidence of processed human remains, how to identify victims when their bodies had been destroyed, and how to protect public health in the wake of crimes so extreme they had no precedent. The economic fallout was severe. The idea that Harlan's sausage and jerky had contained human flesh tainted the entire region's reputation. Hotels and restaurants stopped ordering from mountain butchers. Honest meat processors saw their livelihoods collapse under a wave of suspicion. Some businesses never recovered, and it took decades before eastern Kentucky's food industry regained public trust. The Devil's Creek murders left behind more than a criminal record. They became a cautionary tale about trust, survival, and the darkness that can hide behind respectability. What the Harlans had done was not just murder on a massive scale, but a corruption of community itself, turning neighbors into unwitting participants in one of the most grotesque crimes in American history. For generations after the Harlan brothers were exposed, the story of Devil's Creek lived on in whispered warnings and campfire tales. Over time, folklore reshaped the facts, blending them with superstition. Some insisted the brothers had made a pact with dark forces or possessed unnatural abilities that allowed them to hide their crimes for so long. But the reality, as court testimony and preserved records show, was far more chilling. Their success came not from magic, but from disciplined planning and the cover provided by the isolation of the Kentucky mountains. The land where their homestead once stood became a scar on the valley. Families avoided it, travelers crossed themselves when passing, and for decades no one dared build on that cursed ground. Even today, more than a century later, locals speak of Devil's Creek in hushed tones, and some claim to feel an oppressive weight when walking near the old Harlan property. It is as though the violence of those years seeped into the soil itself. The case revealed just how vulnerable travelers were in the 19th century Appalachians. With no quick way to call for help and few lawmen to patrol such rugged terrain, a family like the Harlans could operate in plain sight for years. Criminologists now regard them as one of the earliest documented examples of organized serial killing in America. Their methods, careful victim selection, systematic disposal of evidence, and laundering profits through a legitimate business were chillingly advanced for the era. Psychological studies based on the records suggest that the brothers shared a cold, calculating temperament that made collaboration possible. What makes their crimes particularly disturbing is how seamlessly they balance the roles of respected neighbors and ruthless predators. To their community, they were skilled butchers and hard-working mountain men. Behind closed doors, they were running a slaughterhouse for human beings. The Devil's Creek case remains a touchstone in both law enforcement and academic circles. It is studied in criminology programs and police training as a stark lesson in how geography, isolation, and misplaced trust can allow predators to thrive. At the same time, the story of Thomas Whitfield endures as proof of the power and the danger of a civilian witness who dares to act. His journals not only expose the Harlans, but also set a precedent for how local knowledge can bring hidden crimes to light. Though the physical evidence was eventually destroyed after the trial's court records and investigative files preserve the details of the Harlans' methods. These documents continue to provide insight into how similar operations might function elsewhere. They remind us that evil does not always announce itself in monstrous forms. Sometimes it wears the mask of normalcy, of respectability, even of neighborly trust. And yet one question lingers. Was everything truly revealed? Or did the Harlans have accomplices who slipped away unnoticed, perhaps operating in other mountain passes, preying on travelers whose stories were never told? The sophistication of the operation has led some to believe 3 men alone could not have carried it out. No proof was ever found, but the possibility remains an unsettling shadow over the history of Devil's Creek. So what do you think? Was the full truth uncovered? Or did others escape justice in those dark Kentucky hills? Share your theory in the comments. And if stories like this captivate you, subscribe, hit the bell, and pass it along to someone who loves unraveling forgotten mysteries. Appalachia holds many more secrets, and together we'll keep digging them up.